Hey, welcome back to our Chronological Bible Study. This is video 50, week 52, day 343 to day 349. This is a video for December 9th to December 15th. We're picking back up after Paul has been imprisoned in Rome, and he's writing his epistles or his letters to various people and churches around Greece. This is our satellite Bible atlas, and this is a map of Paul's third missionary journey. To orient yourself where things are, this is the coast of Israel over here, modern day Syria. This is modern day Turkey. This is our modern day Istanbul up here, known as Constantinople. So over here on this continent you have Asia, and over here begins Europe. What would later become Constantinople is the gateway between Europe and Asia. This is modern day Greece, all in here. Here's Athens, and then this is ancient Sparta right here. You see the island of Crete out here, and then we have the island of Cyprus. This is all North Africa down here. This being Egypt, and the capital of Egypt being Alexandria over here. Using this map to show locations of these letters that Paul has already written. After his first missionary journey, he wrote the letter to the Galatians, which was this region right in here, Galatia. Then we read Thessalonians, which is written to the church at Thessalonica, located over here. Then he wrote some letters to the Corinthians. That's 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Then, of course, he wrote the letter to the Romans. Rome was on past this, over in Rome. We have the Ephesians that he wrote to, which was the church in Ephesus, located here. And then we read Philippians, which was to the church at Philippi, located here. We just finished up the book of Colossians, written to the church at Colossae, located here. So not only has Paul written letters to the churches in those places, he has also written some personal letters. We've read Philemon this week, which was a letter written by Paul to a man named Philemon who was in Colossae. And then we have 1st and 2nd Timothy that we read this week, and that's written by Paul to one of his followers or one of his students named Timothy, who is at Ephesus. And then we have Titus also, which is a contemporary of Timothy, who happens to be on the island of Crete. We know Ephesus are Greeks, those at Ephesus are Greeks, and we know that the island of Crete was the former place of the Minoans, the former civilization called the Minoans. You may know some legends about the Minotaur, who ran amok in this maze, King Minos, who would put people into this maze to be destroyed by this Minotaur. That all took place there on the island of Crete. The Cretans, or the Minoans that were there before this, they're a much different culture than the Greek, although there were some similarities as far as being Greeks. They'll be a little bit more isolated because they were on that island in the middle of the Mediterranean, so their culture had developed a little bit differently. And we'll talk about that when we talk about Titus being on the island of Crete. And to finish off Paul's epistles, I and many scholars also believe that Paul also wrote Hebrews. And if you look at the language that's in Hebrews, and you look at some of the phrases he uses and his knowledge of the Hebrew people and the Old Testament, it points to Paul. So I give Hebrews also to Paul, although that is a debated thing because we don't really know who the author of Hebrews is. If you read Hebrews and you compare it to some of the other letters that Paul wrote, it pretty much points to Paul. Then we have what's called the general epistles, and these are epistles that are written to just general Christians. James is included in this group of general epistles written to general Christians, but he starts it off with saying that he's writing to the Jews of the 12 tribes of Israel who are believers. So we're talking about Christians who are Jews, and that's who James is writing to there. But because they're Christians, it applies also to us Gentile, because Jew and Gentile are the same in Christ. There's no division as far as that goes on an individual basis as far as God is concerned with our salvation. Now there's still some differences on the national scale. Jews still have some promises that have to be fulfilled by God that he made to the nation of Israel. And because of that, because he still has to fulfill those promises to the nation of Israel, we can still say that the nation of Israel, or the Jews, are a separate people than the Gentile. So just on that scale. But in the method of salvation through faith is the same between Jew and Gentile. So the book of James, even though he's writing to the 12 tribes of Israel who are believers, it also applies to all believers. The rest of the general epistles are 1st and 2nd Peter and Jude, and as well as 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. You'll notice that Paul has written a lot of these books of the New Testament. We had Luke that wrote the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. And that in Acts is very, very informative and very important for us to understand what's going on during the early church period, where the apostles are establishing churches in all those areas that we just talked about using the Satellite Bible Atlas. But John has wrote a lot of books of the New Testament as well. So he wrote the Gospel of John, then he writes 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and then he writes Revelation. We have 5 books of the New Testament there that are attributed to John the Apostle. That's really important because John actually walked with Jesus. John was one of the 12. They're all coming from the same person. And this is highly debated among liberal scholars, but through 2,000 years of the church, it's well known that all these books, these 5 books, are attributed to John. Lastly, in the next few weeks, we'll be going over the book of Revelation. And Revelation is written by John to all Christians. However, he focuses in on 7 churches in the first part of the book of Revelation. Also, he reprimands them or commends them for things that they're doing right and things that they're doing wrong, just as Paul had previously done in his letters. When he wrote the Corinthians, he would try to correct them on something, and then he would commend them for the things that they're doing, and in some of the other epistles as well. We see that as well, and then following that information that he gives to those 7 churches that we'll talk about when we get to the book of Revelation and their locations and all that, what's going on in the churches. In addition to that, then he gives this revelation, this revealing that God has given him, and he writes it down, and for all of our benefit. It's a prophecy about things to come in the future. And Revelation is a contested book as well. Liberal scholars will tell you that the book of Revelation has already happened. It's about events that happened in our past during the Roman era. But if you read it literally, which is the way the Bible's supposed to be read, remember these are all letters and stories that are written down by eyewitnesses. And when you're sending one letter to another one, you're not speaking in an allegorical way. You're speaking literally. Okay, so although there is some allegory used throughout the New Testament and in Revelation, it doesn't mean that you can't take the book as a whole as actual literal truth. It's knowing what things to take as literal and what things to take as allegory. And those things are made very plain, because oftentimes the biblical author will say that, and this is an illustration. Paul's already done that a few times in our readings. He says, this is an illustration of so-and-so. So they make it very plain when it's supposed to be allegory, or it is very plain just by the words that they use. So we're going to pick back up our study of this chronology in Colossians. We left off last week in Colossians chapter 1, and we're going to pick back up in Colossians chapter 2, starting in verse 6. And it says, "And now, just as you accepted Christ Jesus as your Lord, you must continue to follow him." He's writing to Gentile Christians who are in Colossae, Christians in general. Now that you've accepted him, you must continue to follow him. You can't just accept him and then go off and do whatever you want. In verse 7, it says, "Let your roots grow down into him, and let your lives be built on him. Then your faith will grow strong in truth, in the truth you were taught, and you will overflow with thankfulness." Well, a tree can't grow, those roots can't go down into the soil without being fertilized and watered, and nutrients has to be given to that tree or the plant or whatever. But also the soil has to be fertile as well. So think about that. Think about this illustration that Paul's using here that it's not only important for you to be rooted in Christ, but for your roots to grow deeper, you also need some nutrients given to the plant through fertilizer and water or sunlight, those kind of things. Well, what are those things? Those things may be being around other Christians who are solid believers, having a spiritual mentor, someone who's older than you and well rooted in the faith that can fertilize your belief. It's also staying in the Word. If you just accept Christ and you don't study His Word, well then what is your faith really based on? This one thing that you heard this one time and you just stopped growing, so your roots didn't grow down anymore. So to continue growing, you've got to keep studying the Word. He says, then your faith will grow strong in the truth you were taught, and you will overflow with thankfulness. Don't let anyone capture you with empty philosophies and high-sounding nonsense that came from human thinking and from the spiritual powers of this world. So, nonsense from human thinking, I can give you a couple of examples of that, like Darwinism, right? That doesn't come from a biblical perspective. It doesn't come from a godly perspective, godly thought, biblical thought. It comes from human rationalization. And if you haven't witnessed that in modern society, humans can rationalize anything. Humans can rationalize that a child that is born one sex should really be another sex. They can rationalize that they're doing good when they're really doing something evil. Rationalization is really a slippery slope, and it's not firm ground to build anything on. So you have to have the objective truth of the Bible as a foundation to build your life upon. In Colossians chapter 3 and verse 1, he says, since you have been raised to new life with Christ, set your sights on the realities of heaven, where Christ sits in the place of honor at God's right hand. Set your sights on heavenly things. Think about the things of heaven, not things of the earth. You died to this life, and your real life is hidden with Christ in God. And when Christ, who is your life, is revealed to the whole world, you will share in all His glory. As Paul's speaking about those things we're going to read about very soon in Revelation, when Christ is revealed to the whole world. In verse 5, so put to death the sinful earthly things lurking within you. Okay, we're going to find out in our reading today that we're led astray by our own desires, by our own sinful desires. And this is what Paul's hitting on here. He says, so put to death the sinful earthly things lurking within you. Have nothing to do with sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires. Don't be greedy, for a greedy person is an idolater, worshiping the things of this world. Because of these sins, the anger of God is coming. You used to do these things when your life was still part of this world, but now is the time to get rid of anger, rage, malicious behavior, slander, dirty language. Don't lie to each other, for you have stripped off your old sinful nature in all its wicked deeds. Put on your new nature and be renewed as you learn to know your Creator and become like Him. In this new life, it doesn't matter whether you are Jew or Gentile, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbaric, uncivilized, slave or free. Christ is all that matters, and He lives in all of us. Then we move over into the letter to Philemon. Now, Philemon is a slave owner who lives in Colossae. And what has happened is one of Philemon's slaves or servants has run away. And he has been caught, and he is in prison in Rome with Paul. And while he's in prison with Paul in Rome, Paul presents the gospel to them, and Onesimus becomes a Christian. Okay, so then Onesimus is released to go back to Philemon, and Paul sends a letter to Philemon. And in this letter, he tells Philemon that he appreciates him, but Onesimus is no longer a servant. He is a brother in Christ, and that he should treat him accordingly. He should release him from his servitude. So that's what the letter is there. And this tells us something about the freedom that comes in our acceptance of Christ. So we're really let go from the earthly restraints or earthly constraints that is put on us by society. And really, it doesn't matter what your neighbor thinks about you. It doesn't matter even what you think about you. It really only matters what God thinks about us. And if you're maintaining your relationship with God and you are being obedient to God, then all these worldly things will either not matter or they will work themselves out, because you are truly being the person God has called you to be, and He will bless you for that. I don't mean He'll make you rich. I mean that He will work out His purposes for you, which are perfect and holy. Onesimus here has gone from being a servant of Philemon to now being a servant of God. He's just changed ownership over to the true owner, who really owns everything anyway. So in this way, Paul is telling Philemon to release Onesimus from his servitude. And then notice there at the end of Philemon, this is chapter 1, verse 22, he says, one more thing, Paul says, he says, one more thing, please prepare a guest room for me, for I'm hoping that God will answer your prayers and let me return to you soon. So this is letter that's written by Paul while he's in prison there in Rome. And we've read several times in his other epistles where Paul is expecting to be released. We talked about at the end of last week that the theory of the fourth missionary journey of Paul, and this is one of the supporting factors, is that Paul fully expects to be released from his imprisonment, where he was imprisoned there for 2 years in Rome. We should also mention again here that first century slavery is not what we Americans or even people in modern day society think of as slavery. This word slavery is the same as what we would call a servant, maybe a house servant, or an indentured servant, someone who is working off a debt, or someone that has maybe gone to some sort of school or has made some journey that someone else financed, and now they are working off that debt by a time of servitude. So it's not always like they're being whipped as slaves. Oftentimes when in our reading where that word slave is used, it's in a totally different context than how we think of slaves today. However, we've read several places in Babylon and Assyria where the people of Israel were taken as slaves. Okay, and they were taking slaves back to another location, and that was done to break up the power of that group. It was done to disunify those people, and yes, some people were put into servitude, but for the most part, your common everyday servant or slave did not suffer that level of deprivation during this day that we're reading now. So in Philippians chapter 1, starting at verse 20, we see that Paul is expecting to be released. Here in verse 20, he says, for I fully expect and hope that I will never be ashamed, but that I will continue to be bold for Christ as I have been in the past. And I trust that my life will bring honor to Christ whether I live or die. So whether I live or die in prison, my life will bring honor to Christ. Verse 21, for to me living means living for Christ, and dying is even better. But if I live, I can do more fruitful work for Christ. So I really don't know which is better. I'm torn between two desires. I long to go to be with Christ if He dies, which would be far better for me, right, is what he says, far better for Paul. And then in verse 24 he says, but for your sakes, Philippians, Christians, but for your sakes it is better that I continue to live. So I can go on and bolster this effort that we have. Verse 25, knowing this, I am convinced that I will remain alive so I can continue to help all of you grow and experience the joy of your faith. And when I come to you again, you will have even more reason to take pride in Christ Jesus because of what He is doing through me. Now, some people may think this is wishful thinking, that he's going to be released from prison and go back to Philippi and talk to them personally. But we've seen lots of evidence here where Paul thinks that he is going to be released from prison. In Philippians chapter 2, we see that starting in verse 19, he says, if Lord Jesus is willing, I hope to send Timothy to you soon for a visit. So Paul has these other followers of him, or I would say disciples of Paul, that are out there doing his work while he's in prison. And he says in verse 22, he says, "But you know how Timothy has proved himself like a son with his father. He has served me in preaching the good news. I hope to send him to you just as soon as I find out what is going to happen to me here. And I have confidence from the Lord that I myself will come to see you soon." So, and now we also see Paul again, he expects to come to them personally, come to Philippi. But before that, in verse 12, he says, "Dear friends, you always followed my instructions when I was with you, and now I am away. It is even more important now that he's away for them to follow his instructions. Work hard to show the results of your salvation, obeying God with deep reverence and fear, for God is working in you, giving you the desire and the power to do what pleases him. Do everything without complaining and arguing, so that no one can criticize you. Live clean, innocent lives as children of God, shining like bright lights in the world full of crooked and perverse people. Hold firmly to the word of life. Then, on the day of Christ's return, I will be proud that I did not run the race in vain and that my work was not useless. But I will rejoice even if I lose my life, pouring it out like a liquid offering to God, just like your faithful service is an offering to God. And I want all of you to share that joy. Yes, you should rejoice, and I will share your joy." So notice, Paul's not preaching that you should be converted and then go on your way and go continue with life. He's preaching that you accept Christ, your old life is buried, and you start this new life. And in this new life, you serve Christ in your daily walk throughout the day. That's not what he's saying, which many people have done throughout the history of Christianity. Like, oh yeah, I got saved and baptized when I was 9 years old, and I'm good to go. Although I've lived 40 years of sin since then. You need to go back and think about where you actually saved at that point. If you've been able to continue going on living a sinful life for the last 40 years, were you actually saved when you were 9? Because there should have been a change to you. Your old self should have been buried, and then a new self should have been born, and then that self should have grown in the likeness of Christ. And if it hasn't done that, you need to go back to the drawing board and see if your conversion actually was a real conversion, or were you just doing what adults were telling you to do. And when we get into the book of James, we notice that this book, as I mentioned earlier, is writing to the 12 tribes, the Jewish believers scattered abroad. And remember, where we last encountered James in the last part of Acts was James was in Jerusalem, and Paul had arrived back from his third missionary journey. Him and Luke had arrived, and they went to go see James, and James said, hey, you need to go to the temple and be part of the ceremony that they're doing. So because all of the Jews now are thinking that you're preaching that Jews don't have to obey the law anymore. So Paul then goes, and that's where he's arrested. So that's the last time we've run into James on our chronology. But there we have this epistle written by James. So as we said earlier, believers who are Jews. And on an individual basis, it doesn't matter whether you're Jew or Gentile, we're all saved the same way, as we said earlier. That difference only matters on a national level. So if we go to James chapter 1, we go down to verse 12. James is actually very intelligent, has a lot of good common sense things in here. So we've gone from this high level of thinking where Paul, you remember Paul is a Pharisee, he's a well-studied man, a well-learned man, and now we've gone down to some more kind of where the rubber meets the road, kind of common sense teaching with James. And to me, it's a breath of fresh air because I'm kind of a common sense where the rubber meets the road kind of guy. So in James chapter 1, verse 12, he says that God blesses those who patiently endure testing and temptation. Afterward, they will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him. And remember, when you are being tempted, do not say, God is tempting me. God is never tempted to do wrong, and he never tempts anyone else. Temptation comes from our own desires, which entice us and drag us away. These desires give birth to sinful actions, and then when sin is allowed to grow, it gives birth to death. So we see we still have this sin nature. He's writing to Christians, So we still have this sin nature because we're in this flesh. We're still in this life, right? And we still have that original sin from Adam that we were born into. Remember, we were talked about several months ago, we were sin babies, just the same as a drug baby is more prone to get addicted to a drug. We're sin babies. We're born with that aptitude or that inclination to sin in the multitude of ways in which we can sin. James points this out and says that our temptation comes from within us, not from without us. Yes, the devil is the tempter, he is the deceiver, and he will lay those temptations before us. But it comes from our own flesh, where we look at that sin and we go, that's really, really, really enticing, and I really would like to take part in that. So that's what James is pointing out here in a very common sense kind of way. And he says that what comes from those desires is that those desires give birth to those sinful actions. And then the sin, when it's allowed to grow, gives birth to death. If you've seen people, or maybe even you, maybe you've come to this point where you've just been able to sin without restraint. And when you're allowed to sin without any kind of restraint, any kind of conviction or anything, you will continue to sin, and you will continue to spiral down this black hole of sin until you finally see that the only option is death. You'll see that as your only way out. And because all these things that we do, we then are condemned by those things that we do, and then Satan then uses those things against us, right? And every time we might try to come up for fresh air, we might come up and be like, oh no, maybe this is a light, I can maybe there's some salvation here, maybe there's a way to get out of this black hole. And you reach up and you try to pull yourself out of that. Okay, when you try to do that, Satan's there telling you, oh no, remember all those things that you did? The same entity that lays the sins before us and deceives us is the same one who accuses us of those sins that he enticed us to do in the first place. But there's only one end to sin, and that is death. That's what the devil wants. He wants to condemn us all, and for us all to die before we can receive that redemption. And for us just to see, like, all right, there's no way out of this. And every level that you go down in this spiral, it's just you get more condemnation on top of you, and you just feel more and more and more unworthy. The further you go down, the more unworthy you feel to receive any kind of salvation. And that's not the way salvation works. Jesus Christ came to earth to suffer the punishment that we all deserve, and he gives us the free gift of salvation. All we have to do is accept it. We don't have to earn it through being good. If you accept Christ, you will become good, because as we've talked about several times, God will chop off those branches that bear no fruit, and branches will grow that do produce good fruit. There are those people who believe that they have to do things in order to be saved, whether it is to take part in a religious ceremony of some sort, or whether it is going out and doing things. There's this overwhelming misjudgment among our society, and probably human society, that you can do enough good things to get into heaven. And that is not at all true. Not at all true. Jesus said that there will be many that will come to him and say, Lord, Lord, I did all these great things in your name. And he'll say, away from me, I never knew you. Okay? So it is not through the things that we do that we're saved. The things we do are a result of the faith that we have. This is the passage in James where the people that believe that they are saved through the things that they do will reference. It seems like James is saying here that you have to do things in order to be saved. So we're going to go to James chapter 2, starting in verse 14. He says, what good is it, dear brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith but don't show it by your actions? Can that kind of faith save anyone? Suppose you see a brother or sister who has no food or clothing, and you say, goodbye and have a good day, stay warm and eat well. But then you don't give that person any food or clothing. What good does that do? You can have all the best wishes in the world. You can say, well, I'll pray for you and I'll do that. And yes, that is something if you pray for them. But if you just give them warm wishes and you actually don't do anything about it to help them, you're not completing the action. So what James is calling us to do, he's calling us to complete our faith by action. Verse 17, he says, so you see, faith by itself isn't enough. Unless it produces good deeds, it is dead and useless. So who is it dead and useless to? It's dead and useless to the world, the people that you're trying to share the gospel with. So there has to be actions that accompany the faith. Verse 18, now someone may argue, some people have faith, others have good deeds. But I say, how can you show me your faith if you don't have good deeds? I will show you my faith by my good deeds. You say you have faith, for you believe that there is one God. Good for you. Even the demons believe this, and they tremble in terror. Even the demons, the fallen angels who fell with Satan, believe there is one God. Well, good for you. And you'll often hear this. Well, I believe in God. Well, good. So does Lucifer. He believes in God too. Actually, he's looked at him face to face at the throne of God in heaven. He believes in God. He's still going to hell. So just believing in God is not enough. You have to have faith. You have to live it out as well. And that's what James is getting at. He says, can't you see that faith without good deeds is useless? Don't you remember that our ancestor Abraham was shown to be right with God by his actions when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? Okay, he's thinking back. He's talking to Hebrews, talking to Jews, and he's saying, remember back to Abraham. And now remember, context here, he's writing to Jews. Jews are going to know, if they don't know any other part of the Bible, they're going to know about their ancestor Abraham because they are part of that Abrahamic covenant. Remember, all men are circumcised on the 8th day. Okay, that's the sign of the Abrahamic covenant, saying that, hey, I'm a part of this promise that God made to Abraham and his descendants. If anybody's going to remember the stories that he's about to reference with Abraham, it's going to be these people he's writing to, and that's why James uses these passages here. He says, you see, his faith and his actions work together. His actions made his faith complete. And that's the key verse. His actions made his faith complete, right? And that's what James is getting at. You can't just have faith. If you have true faith, it should result in action. Verse 23, and so it happened just as the scriptures say. Abraham believed God, and God counted him as righteous because of his faith. He was even called the friend of God. So you see, we are shown to be right with God by what we do, not by faith alone. Well, those who believe in salvation by works rather than salvation by faith alone would use this verse, verse 24, to argue that you're saved through the things you do, not by simply your faith in God. Well, that seems contradictory to Genesis chapter 15. So James here, he cites two passages that are in Genesis. One, where in Genesis 15, where Abraham is counted as righteous because of his faith. And then another one in Genesis chapter 22, where he's counted as righteous because of his obedience to God. So we're going to look at those two passages right now, and we're going to look at what James is trying to illustrate here. And it's all summed up in this one sentence here. Abraham's actions made his faith complete. That's really the main point of this passage. Not that you're saved through works, not saved through the things you do. Okay, so we're going to go back to Genesis chapter 15, starting in verse 1, and we're going to look at the first time that he's counted as righteous by faith. So in verse 1, it says, sometime later the Lord spoke to Abram in a vision and said to him, do not be afraid, Abram, for I will protect you, and your reward will be great. But Abram replied, O sovereign Lord, what good are all your blessings when I don't even have a son? Since you've given me no children, Eleazar of Damascus, a servant in my household, will inherit all my wealth. You have given me no descendants of my own, so one of my servants will be my heir. In verse 4, the Lord said to him, no, your servant will not be your heir, for you will have a son, and the son of your own who will be your heir. Then the Lord took Abram outside and said to him, "Look up into the sky and count the stars if you can. That's how many descendants you will have." And this is the verse that we're referencing, verse 6. "And Abraham believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith." So because Abraham believed and had faith, he was counted as righteous right here, just because of his faith. So we'll talk about this in Hebrews chapter 11. Paul has already talked about it before. Abram being counted as righteous because of his faith. At this point, there's nothing in here about something that he has to do. And remember, when we were going over the covenants, the Abrahamic covenant is an unconditional covenant. God made the unconditional promise to Abraham of his descendants. All right? Well, God still has to honor that promise. We see that this is the place where Abram is counted as righteous. Now, after this point, this whole conversation is in the context of Abram having a son. He doesn't at this point have a son. And they actually take things into their own hands after this. One of his wife's servant girls, Hagar, is given to him as a wife. And she actually produces a son named Ishmael. And we followed that line when we were studying the Old Testament. That's where all the Ishmaelites come from. And the descendants of Ishmael and descendants of Isaac still fight back and forth even to this day. But Ishmael was not the chosen son. But because they took things into their own hands, it threw everything out of whack, and they have these Ishmaelites now and the descendants of the Ishmaelites that they have to deal with. So let's look at this next reference that James is talking about. That's over in Genesis chapter 22. In verse 13, we see that it says, "Then Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught by its horns in a thicket. So he took the ram and sacrificed as a burnt offering in a place of his son." So the son that he's sacrificing there is Isaac. This is the promised son. This is the son that we had just read about in Genesis 15, where God was going to give him an heir, and then this Abrahamic covenant was going to be fulfilled through this son that he has. Okay, but now Abraham's been told to go to Mount Moriah and sacrifice this one chosen son. Abraham, despite all this information and despite the fact that this seems to conflict with the promise that he made before, he's obeying. He's putting action to his faith. He was counted as righteous by his faith, but his faith has resulted in actions of obedience. In verse 15, "The angel of the Lord called again to Abraham from heaven." This is what the Lord says, "Because you have obeyed me and have not withheld even your son, your only son." Now remember, this isn't his only son. He has another son named Ishmael that was given to him by Hagar, okay? And they've been banished. They're no longer part of his household. So this isn't his only son. And this is an ancient translation thing. The word "only" is more like unique. This is your unique son or your chosen son. "Because you've obeyed me and have not withheld even your son, your only son, your chosen son, your unique son, I swear by my own name that I will certainly bless you. I will multiply your descendants beyond number like the stars in the sky and sand on the seashore. Your descendants will conquer the cities of their enemies, and through your descendants all the nations of the earth will be blessed. All because you have obeyed me," because your faith resulted in action. And that's all James is getting across to the Jews that he's writing to. And the Jews that he's writing to are very familiar with this story of Abram. To do a little thought experiment right here. Say that Abraham only had works and not faith here. Say that Genesis 15 never happened. He was not counted as righteous by his faith, by his belief. And he didn't expect for God to fulfill this promise while he's taking his chosen son, his unique son, to Mount Moriah, knowing that he has to sacrifice him. Think about now, if Genesis 15 had not happened, if Abraham had never had faith and he only had works, if he had only taken his son to Mount Moriah and done the thing without the faith behind it, he would be no different than the people who sacrificed their children to Molech that we read about in the Old Testament. They would take their babies, they would put them in this statue, and they would burn up in the statue. They would sacrifice their children to this false god. Okay, which also, by the way, is representative of Satan. That's why God detests child sacrifice, because this is what these idols, who are demons, that's what they demand from the people who worship them. So in stark contrast to that, God tells his people to not take part in child sacrifice. And in fact, they're punished if they do take part in child sacrifice. So if Abraham had not had faith and he had just gone there to sacrifice Isaac, we would be dealing with an entirely different scenario here. We'd be dealing with Abraham who is no different than the people that his descendants will conquer in the land of Canaan. We would be talking about a very sinful, evil act here. This action that he's taking by trusting God and taking Isaac to Mount Moriah for sacrifice is an act of obedience to the faith that he already had. So you can't have obedience, you can't have works without the faith. Just like James is saying, you can't have faith without the works, because your faith is going to result in works. It's going to result in the working out of that faith. As James says there in James chapter 2, verse 22, he says, Abraham's actions made his faith complete. And that's what James is illustrating here. He's not saying that we're saved by the things we do. He's saying that the things we do that are holy are the completion of the faith that we already have. And that's why he uses these passages of Abraham as a reference when he's talking to these people. Then we move into Paul's letters to Timothy, specifically 1 Timothy here in chapter 1. For the setting, he says that when I left for Macedonia, I urged you to stay there in Ephesus and stop those whose teaching is contrary to the truth. So Timothy has been there during this whole time that Paul had returned to Jerusalem and then been arrested and then been imprisoned. So Timothy's been at Ephesus for some time. So Timothy was sent there as like a delegate of Paul, to be there in Paul's stead. And so Paul sends directions to Timothy, very specific directions about things that should be going on in the church and how to set up the church. And we're supposed to set up our church and mirror our church after these churches that the apostles had started, at the direction that the apostles have given the churches, as well as to those delegates that he put in charge of those churches. So here you see that Timothy is not acting as an elder or a bishop in the church. He's not acting that way. He's acting as a messenger, a delegate, instead of Paul. So he's delivering this information and making sure that the church is functioning the way that it's supposed to. So Paul sends very specific directions to Timothy and Titus also for them to do specific things in the church. And we're just going to go over a few of them here. This is talking about overseers here, or some translations will say elders, some translations will say overseer, some will say bishop, those people who are in charge of the church, who are responsible for it. We're not talking about deacons here, we're talking about elders, overseers, bishops. In some denominations in America, we have one overseer, who is the pastor, and then we have deacons who are serving kind of in an elder role. And then in other churches, other denominations, we have a elder board who is more kind of in the biblical standing. We have an elder board of which the pastor is one of. So there's a board of elders. And then we have deacons who are also there who serve a completely different function. We have deacons who aren't doing deacon things, they're doing elder things, and nobody's doing the deacon thing. We have to look here to 1 Timothy to get very clear directions on what they're supposed to do. Remember, we read back in Acts after the day of Pentecost that they chose 7 deacons to take care of the physical needs of the people. And that's what deacons are supposed to be doing. They're supposed to be making sure that Aunt Martha, who's sick, who couldn't come to church, or maybe she is a shut-in, is make sure that she's well taken care of. To make sure that widows and orphans are taken care of. That's the primary function of deacons, is doing the things, whereas the primary function of the elders or the overseers or the bishops is to run the church. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1, it says, "This is a trustworthy saying. If someone aspires to be a church leader, this translation uses the word church leader. This is also the word overseer, bishop, elder. So if someone aspires to be an elder, he desires an honorable position. So a church leader must be a man whose life is above reproach. He must be faithful to his wife. He must exercise self-control, live wisely, have a good reputation. He must enjoy having guests in his home, and he must be able to teach. So he has to be able to teach as well as being all these good character traits. He must not be a heavy drinker, or be violent. I've had this discussion with many people before that you can't drink alcohol if you're a bishop, an overseer, elder, right? And that's kind of more legalistic looking at it. What the Bible actually says is that you shouldn't drink much wine. Okay, you shouldn't be a heavy drinker, as this translation says. It doesn't say that you can't take part in it. You can't have one drink. But put that into context too. A drinker of much wine during the first century, wine was their common drink, that they drank everything, because a lot of the water wasn't good for drinking. So when you drank wine, when you drank a fermented drink, you knew that it wasn't going to give you dysentery. You weren't going to get sick from it. So it wasn't that they were drinking to drink the way that we drink alcohol today. Today we have drinks that are made specifically for the purpose to make you drunk, to give you that little release. And that's not what is happening here in the first century. They're saying that you can't be a drinker of much wine, meaning that you can't get drunk, is really what the purpose of it is really what they're getting at. Because if you drank enough of that kind of wine, you would eventually get drunk. So you take that into context. However, should you drink any alcohol at all? Because what alcohol is today is not what it was in the first century. Today it's made for the purpose of getting you drunk. In the first century it wasn't. It was just a beverage that would drink to not give you dysentery. So you can take that to that extent, or you could take it as, okay, well, as long as I don't get drunk, then I'm okay. Either way, you shouldn't be a heavy drinker or be violent. Okay, so being violent is just as much a disqualifier as being a drunkard is. He must be gentle, not quarrelsome, not love money. He must manage his own family well. For if a man cannot manage his own household, how can he take care of God's church? A church leader must not be a new believer, because he might become proud, and the devil would cause him to fall. I've witnessed many young pastors that get out of some kind of Bible college or seminary, and then they end up starting a church, and they're very successful, and then they're led astray by some way or another. And a lot of that comes because of this pride that Paul's talking about here. They're basically a new believer. They're not an elder. They're not lived very long, and they have not been introduced. They've not been tempted. They've not gone through these trials of life that has resulted in them being more resolute in their faith. So they're caught kind of unaware when they're hit for the first time by things like desire and lust. This woman that comes that's maybe in this congregation, and she flirts with him, and he kind of likes that, and one thing leads to another, and now you got a pastor who is now in charge of a whole church of people who is not meeting the definition of pastor. He's not even meeting the definition of Christian anymore, and he's continuing to hold the office. That's only going to end one way. That's going to spiral down until it causes destruction. And what's really horrible about that is that when this pastor who's been led astray finally reaches rock bottom, he's taking that congregation, some members of that congregation with him. And some of them may turn away from the faith or may turn away from the church because of this man's actions. It's very important to make sure that the men that you're chosen as overseers, as bishops, as elders, are qualified in these ways. It says, also people outside the church must speak well of him, so that he will not be disgraced and fall into the devil's trap. So that's our elder qualification, bishop, right? That's our preacher, our pastor qualifications there. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. Then we move into deacons. In the same way, deacons must be well respected and have integrity. They must not be heavy drinkers or dishonest with money. They must be committed to the mystery of the faith now revealed and must live with a clear conscience. Before they are appointed as deacons, let them be closely examined. If they pass the test, then let them serve as deacons. In the same way, their wives must be respected and must not slander others. They must exercise self-control and be faithful in everything they do. And if a deacon's wife has these qualifications, don't you think an overseer's wife would have these qualifications as well, because it's a position of more responsibility. In verse 12 it says, a deacon must be faithful to his wife, and he must manage his children and household well. Those who do well as deacons will be rewarded with respect from others and will have increased confidence in their faith in Christ Jesus. So we have those two offices specifically chosen. And if we look at the biblical definition of our overseer, our bishop, our elder, or in this translation here in 1 Timothy chapter 3 uses the word church leader. The church leader, there's supposed to be many of them, of which there is one who is the preacher, or is that active preacher during that day. But what's different than today is, like in churches that we visited, well, some that we visited, if the pastor's gone that week or there's an emergency or something like that, they have to call in a pastor from another church or a pastor who's on call that's part of some association that can fill a spot for that week. Well, that's not the way it's supposed to be. There's supposed to be other elders who are in the church, elders in the church who can step up and take his position. Okay, so the way things are nowadays, if people really read their Bible and really held to what the Bible says rather than what they've always done, things would be a lot different. 1 Timothy chapter 5, Paul gives us directions on how we're supposed to take care of widows and how we're supposed to tell whether a widow should be getting assistance from the church. And that cutoff seems to be the age of 60. So it says here in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 3, it says, take care of any widow who has no one else to take care of her. If she has children or grandchildren, their first responsibility is to show godliness at home and repay their parents by taking care of them. As Christians should take care of our parents and our grandparents, it says. This is something that pleases God. It says it pleases God for us to do that. Verse 5, now a true widow, a woman who is truly alone in this world, a widow who now is reliant on God, totally 100% reliant on God because she has no one else to provide for her. Verse 8, but those who won't care for their relatives, especially those in their own household, have denied the true faith. Such people are worse than unbelievers. So if you don't take care of your parents and grandparents, and when they're not able to take care of themselves, you're worse than an unbeliever. Verse 9, a widow who is put on the list for support must be a woman who is at least 60 years old and was faithful to her husband. The younger widows should not be on the list because their physical desires will overpower their devotion to Christ and they will want to remarry. Because these widows are still able to actually provide for themselves, they're young enough to do things for themselves, they shouldn't be reliant on the church. So I advise these younger widows to marry again, have children, and take care of their own homes. So we've finished up our portion about widows. Now we're getting to elders. Elders who do their work well should be respected and paid well. So this is that same word in Greek that was just translated over in 1 Timothy chapter 3 as church leader, also known as bishop, also known as pastor, also known as overseer. If they do their work well, they should be respected and paid well, especially those who work hard at both preaching and teaching. Now remember, being able to teach was a qualification for being an elder. So we know who exactly we're talking about here. And it says, for the scripture says, you must not muzzle an ox to keep it from eating as it treads out the grain. What that means is you got an ox who is walking around and he's stepping on all the grain, and the grain is being separated from the chaff. He's stepping on it. He is doing this task. The ox is working. And this law that was given back in the Torah said that you can't muzzle him. You can't keep him from eating while he is working. Paul uses this law as a reference here to say that you can't expect an elder, overseer, a bishop, a pastor to continue on working as hard as they work, or as hard as they should be working, without some sort of pay. So this is where we get the idea that your elders should be paid. To finish up 1 Timothy, we're going to go to chapter 6, verse 17. Paul says, teach those who are rich in this world not to be proud and not to trust in their money, which is so unreliable. Their trust should be in God, who richly gives us all we need for our enjoyment. Now think about this. What is money really? Money is an object. Originally it started out as a metal that someone come along and said, hey, this shiny piece of metal has value, and I can trade this little shiny piece of metal for your services, or this thing that I want that you have. It's an agreement that's being made. It's not that that little piece of metal actually has any value. It only has value because we say it has value, because society says that it has value. It actually in itself doesn't have much value. Let's take the Incas. When the Spanish went to South America, the Incas had used gold as a metal to build things and to decorate things. All it was to them was a metal, a workable, easily pliable metal, a soft metal that they could use. But when the Spanish came there, they saw gold. Wow, this is really, really valuable. The Incas didn't see it that way. It was a metal like any other, copper, tin, any other metal that they dug out of the earth. Well, the Spanish then sees this value in this metal and then starts taking all of this metal from the Incas, and the Incas don't really understand really what's going on. That gold that the Spanish were taking from the Incas only had value because they had made an agreement, a societal agreement, that it had value. You can't eat it. It doesn't give you shelter. It doesn't do actually anything that's really good. It's just has value because we say it has value. In America here, where we had so much gold, and then we made a verbal agreement that these pieces of paper were going to represent a piece of gold. So rather than us carrying around a piece of gold and exchanging it for a service like they did in years and years and centuries past, we said, okay, this piece of paper is going to represent a piece of gold, a fraction of gold. And then we started exchanging those pieces of paper rather than the piece of metal. Well, now in today's society, we don't even exchange pieces of paper that represent gold anymore. And in fact, we don't even have the amount of gold that we did. Currency isn't even worth the amount of gold that it used to be worth. So now we're just really exchanging digits. We're exchanging things that don't exist. And we're all taking part in a verbal agreement that these digits that are in the computer have some kind of value. Okay, so that's how far off track we've gotten. And that's what Paul's saying here. He's saying really your money is unreliable. It really has no value, really. So you shouldn't put your faith in money because it really is not valuable at all. It only has value because society agrees that it has value. Paul's saying that don't rely on that because it's a slippery slope. We've gone from gold to paper, now to digits. We're really exchanging air. We're exchanging nothing. Verse 18, he says, tell them to use their money to do good. They should be rich in good works and generous to those in need, always being ready to share with others. So use that money for actual things that are good, instead of just storing up this false security that you're going to have enough digits to survive whatever thing is coming your way. Actually use those digits to do something good with. As we read Titus, we'll notice that Paul gives the same directions to Titus, who is in Crete, as he does Timothy, who is in Ephesus. And remember, we talked about at the beginning of the video, the Ephesians are not exactly the same people as the Cretans. And notice that the directions given to Titus for those Christians in Crete is no different than the directions he gave to Timothy in Ephesus. So we're not to change how we run a church based on the people that are in it. We have very specific directions on how to run the church and what we're supposed to teach the church. And that doesn't change depending on the people that you're teaching. You're still teaching the same truth. You're still running the church the same way. regardless of who is in the church at that specific place. That's all we're going to cover this week. This next week we're going to go into 2 Timothy. We'll get into one of my favorite books called Hebrews. And then we will be getting into the other general epistles of 1st, 2nd Peter and 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John before we finally move into Revelation with the completion of our chronological Bible study this year.